There comes a point in every empath's life where they stop confusing love with emotional labor, a point where they stop calling their exhaustion patience and stop mistaking someone's emotional distance for depth. And that moment, that pivot, is when everything changes. See, avoidant people often believe they hold the power because they hold their feelings back. They think silence is control. They think distance is mystery. They think inconsistency makes them irreplaceable, but they forget one truth. The person who is capable of deep love is also capable of walking away with deep certainty. Empaths don't leave impulsively. They leave intentionally. And that is why a fed-up empath is the avoidant's greatest threat. Because the empath is the one who saw their potential. The empath is the one who filled the gaps, translated the moods, connected the dots the avoidant refused to draw. The empath gave grace where others would have given up. But when grace turns into self-betrayal, something powerful happens. The empath wakes up. And when they wake up, they stop chasing clarity from someone who treats clarity like a liability. They stop apologizing for having needs. They stop negotiating for the bare minimum. And most importantly, they stop being impressed by emotional unavailability. Suddenly, the avoidant loses their biggest advantage, the empath's willingness to overfunction. A fed-up empath doesn't play the game. They break it. They stop responding to mixed signals. They stop interpreting breadcrumbs as promises. They stop managing someone else's discomfort at the cost of their own peace. And here's the twist. When the empath finally pulls back, not as a strategy, but as self-respect, the avoidant realizes something they never expected. Distance works both ways. The empath's silence isn't revenge. It's recalibration. It's reclaiming power. It's the recognition that I deserve more is stronger than I hope you change. A fed-up empath becomes dangerous to the avoidant, not because they re-cruel, but because they finally prioritize themselves. Because they finally understand that loving someone who can't meet you is not compassion, it's captivity. And once an empath chooses freedom, there is no guilt, no second-guessing, no looking back. A fed-up empath doesn't destroy the avoidant. They simply stop allowing the avoidant to destroy themselves. And that is where real change begins. An empath often grows up believing that love is something you prove through endurance. They learn to be the person who listens longer, forgives faster, and holds space even when no one is holding space for them. Over time, this becomes a silent identity, the strong one, the patient one, the one who can understand what others refuse to articulate. At first, this feels like a gift. They can sense emotions others hide, pick up on tension others ignore, and offer comfort where others fall silent. But when this gift is placed in the wrong hands, especially in the hands of someone who is avoidant, it becomes a trap disguised as devotion. Avoidant individuals often respond to conflict or closeness with withdrawal, and the empath unconsciously interprets this as a call to give more. More reassurance, more effort, more emotional translation. They search for the hidden meaning behind the distance, trying to soothe what they assume must be fear, insecurity, or unspoken pain. And in doing so, they begin to shoulder the entire weight of the relationship. They measure love not by reciprocity, but by resilience. The more they can carry, the more loyal they believe they are. But this loyalty comes at a cost. Not immediately, not loudly, but quietly, through the erosion of self-trust. Every time the empath tells themselves it's okay that they are hurting because the other person is hurting more, they reinforce a dangerous belief that their feelings are secondary. They normalize emotional imbalances. They justify behaviors that leave them uncertain or drained. They begin to take pride in their capacity to endure rather than their capacity to be respected. And here is where the shift becomes essential. There is a moment, slow or sudden, where the empath recognizes the imbalance not as love, but as self-neglect. It might come after one too many apologies for needs that were never unreasonable. It might arrive after realizing the avoidant never becomes more open, despite all the empath's effort. Or it might hit when the empath wakes up feeling empty in a relationship they are constantly pouring into. This is the moment that rewrites everything. The empath begins to see that love should not be measured by the depths of their emotional tolerance. It should not be proven through exhaustion. Connection is not validated by the amount of discomfort they can absorb without complaint. Real love is not a test of endurance. It is an exchange, equal, honest, and reciprocal. With this realization, the empath's internal narrative starts to shift. They no longer mistake emotional labor for intimacy. They stop confusing emotional responsibility with emotional bonding. They understand that their heart is not an endless resource to be mined by someone unwilling to meet them where they stand. And slowly they reclaim the right to their own emotional well-being. They recognize that their ability to feel deeply is not a currency meant to purchase someone else's stability. It is a strength meant to be shared, honored, and matched. Avoidant behavior often thrives in relationships where one person is willing to stretch themselves beyond what is healthy. The avoidant relies, consciously or unconsciously, on the idea that the other person will pick up the emotional slack. When an empath is involved, this dynamic becomes even more pronounced. Empaths tend to sense disconnection as an invitation to try harder, to be gentler, to understand the silence instead of reacting to it. They compensate for the avoidance withdrawal by becoming more emotionally available, believing that their consistency can inspire security. But this very pattern gives avoidant tendencies their power. Avoidants often operate from the belief that closeness is risky and vulnerability is unsafe, when the empath is always the one stepping forward. Always initiating conversations, always soothing discomfort, the avoidant learns that they don't have to do the emotional work. The empath will do it for them. Distance becomes a tool, intentionally or unintentionally, because it gets a response. Pulling away becomes a way to maintain control, not in a manipulative sense, but in the sense that avoiding closeness keeps them feeling protected. As long as the empath is willing to bridge the emotional gap, the avoidant never has to examine the impact of their detachment. But everything changes when the empath stops over-functioning. When the empath finally reaches a point where they stop chasing reassurance, stop analyzing every silence, and stop interpreting avoidance as something they're responsible for fixing, the entire power dynamic collapses. Suddenly the avoidance distance no longer yields connection. Their withdrawal no longer draws the empath in. Their silence is no longer met with soothing or explanations or emotional translations. The avoidant is left with the bare reality of their own behavior, and that is something they rarely expect. When the empath pulls back, not out of spite, but out of self-respect, the avoidant loses the emotional cushion they have grown accustomed to. The empath's effort was the stabilizer that made the avoidant's behavior appear functional. Without it, the avoidant is confronted with a kind of emotional gravity they have never had to experience. Their patterns don't get rewarded, softened, or compensated for. The space they create becomes actual space, not a lure for the empath's healing instinct. This shift forces the avoidant to see something they've been able to ignore. Emotional distance doesn't protect relationships, it erodes them. And without the empath working overtime, the avoidant must face the discomfort they've been avoiding, questions about vulnerability, intimacy, and personal responsibility. It's a confrontation with themselves rather than with the empath. For the empath, this shift is liberating. They realize that their value is not tied to how much of themselves they can pour into someone who isn't pouring back. They see that love doesn't require them to take on the job of emotional regulation for two. And in reclaiming that balance, they stop playing a part in a dynamic that once made them feel small. Avoidant behavior only holds power when the empath keeps giving beyond their limits. Once the empath steps back and stops doing the emotional heavy lifting, the dynamic resets. The avoidant no longer dictates the rhythm of connection. The empath no longer dances around someone else's fear. A healthier balance becomes possible, but only when the empath stops enabling the imbalance. When an empath reaches the point of being fed up, their silence carries a very different energy than the silence of an avoidant. An avoidant's silence is usually a shield, an escape from emotional intensity, a retreat from vulnerability, or a way to regain a sense of control. But an empath's silence, once they have reached their limit, is no. About avoidance. It is about clarity. It is about choosing peace over chaos. It is about stepping away from a dynamic that has asked them to carry emotional weight that was never theirs to hold. And because this silence is born from self-respect rather than fear, it becomes powerful in a way that avoidant behavior never anticipates. For so long, the empath's instinct has been to repair. Every conflict becomes an invitation to understand the other person more deeply. Every withdrawal becomes a problem they believe they should solve. Every cold moment is met with warmth. Every unclear moment with explanation. This responsiveness teaches the avoidant unintentionally that the empath will always close the emotional distance, no matter who created it. So when the empath finally stops responding in this way, it disrupts the entire rhythm of the relationship. The silence of a fed-up empath is not a tactic. It isn't a game or a punishment designed to get a reaction. It is the moment they stop negotiating with behaviors that are hurting them. It is the moment they decide that if the only way to maintain a connection is to silence their own needs, then it's not a connection worth maintaining. This is why their silence hits differently. It is grounded in truth. They are no longer acting from fear of losing the other person. They are acting from the fear of losing themselves. To the avoidant, who is used to emotional distance being met with pursuit, this shift is jarring. They are accustomed to pulling away and being chased, to giving less and receiving more. When the empath stops over-explaining, stops soothing, and stops filling the silence, the avoidant is confronted with the impact of their own behavior. Instead of being rewarded with reassurance, they are met with space. Instead of being pursued, they are met with calm. Instead of being rescued from discomfort, they are left to sit with it. And this is the moment when the avoidant realizes something they never considered. The empath was not emotionally dependent. They were emotionally committed. And commitment can be withdrawn. Meanwhile, for the empath, this silence brings a quiet strength. They begin to feel the difference between peace and guessing, between connection and caretaking. They start to understand that communication is not something they should carry alone. They learn that love is not sustainable when only one person is emotionally available. Their silence becomes a boundary that doesn't need to be explained, defended, or justified. It's implies. This silence is transformation. It reflects a shift from "I hope you choose me" to "I choose myself." It is not cold or punishing. It is protective. It is an emotional recalibration, and the empath's silence often reveals what words never could, that they were never asking for too much, they were simply asking the wrong person. When an empath reaches a place where they finally honor their own worth, something profound changes in the way they relate to others. For most of their lives, empaths are conditioned, sometimes by family dynamics, sometimes by early relationships, sometimes simply by habit, to treat their needs as something secondary, something easily postponed, or something that can wait until everyone else is okay. They learn to prioritize harmony over honesty, understanding over expression, and connection over personal boundaries. At first, this feels noble. It feels loving. It feels like they're being the bigger person. But over time, it becomes clear that constantly sidelining their own emotional needs doesn't lead to deeper relationships. It leads to deeper self-abandonment. When an empath enters a relationship with someone avoidant, this pattern intensifies. Avoidants often interpret emotional needs as pressure, vulnerability as danger, and closeness as something they must protect themselves from. So, in an attempt to preserve the relationship, the empath shrinks their needs even further. They become hyper-aware of not wanting to come off as too much, too sensitive, or too demanding. They start downplaying their feelings, cushioning their truths, and filtering their emotional expressions to avoid triggering the avoidance withdrawal. Over time, this creates a quiet imbalance. The empath becomes the emotional container, holding everything, the misunderstandings, the compromises, the disappointments, the hopes. And the avoidant becomes accustomed to this dynamic because it asks nothing of them. The empath becomes the safe harbor where the avoidant's discomfort is always soothed, but where the empath's comfort is often overlooked. This reinforces the empath's old belief that having needs makes them a burden. So they keep shrinking, adjusting, and sacrificing, But something inevitable happens when an empath gets fed up. The belief that their needs are too much starts to crumble. They begin to see that the problem was never the presence of needs, it was the absence of boundaries. They realize that asking for emotional consistency is not demanding, it's healthy. Wanting clear communication is not needy, it's foundational. Expecting reciprocity is not unreasonable, it's how relationships grow. This awareness marks the moment when the empath stops treating their needs as inconveniences and starts treating them as essential parts of who they are. Once this shift takes place, the way the empath shows up in relationships changes drastically. They no longer apologize for wanting clarity. They no longer feel guilty for asking questions that matter. They no longer contort themselves to make someone else comfortable at the expense of their own emotional safety. Instead, they become grounded, self-assured, and clear. Their boundaries no longer sound like threats, they sound like truth. And truth doesn't need to be defended, it just needs to be lived. For the avoidant, this new version of the empath can be unsettling. The empath is no longer predictable and they're overgiving. They no longer rush to fix every emotional gap or smooth over every disconnect. They no longer treat emotional breadcrumbs as full meals. Suddenly, the avoidant is faced with a partner who expects real presence, not just proximity. And if the avoidant is unwilling or unable to meet those expectations, the empath, with newfound strength, will walk away. This transformation shows that the empath never wanted too much. They simply wanted what every person deserves: respect, reciprocity, and genuine connection. And once they treat their needs like boundaries instead of burdens, they stop settling for anything less. When an empath finally reaches the point where they are no longer willing to overextend themselves, the entire dynamic with an avoidant partner shifts. For so long, the avoidant has operated with a kind of unconscious confidence that the empath's patience will always stretch a little farther, that their forgiveness will always be available, and that their emotional labor will always bridge the gap. This access becomes a silent advantage. The avoidant may not articulate it, and often they don't even consciously realize it, but they come to depend on the empath's effort as the stabilizing force of the relationship. The empath becomes the emotional engine that keeps everything moving, even when the avoidant refuses to engage. What the avoidant fears losing is not the empath's love. They assume love lasts. What they fear, often without realizing it, is losing the empath's effort. That constant flow of reassurance, interpretation, emotional grounding, and understanding. The empath is the one who translates mixed signals into something meaningful. The empath is the one who maintains connection even when the avoidant withdraws. The empath is the one who gives warmth when faced with coldness, clarity when met with confusion, and presence when met with distance. This effort becomes the invisible glue holding everything together. But when an empath becomes fed up, that glue dissolves. And the avoidant suddenly faces a reality they never prepared for. Connection requires participation. It requires reciprocity. It requires emotional presence. Without the empath doing the work for both of them, the relationship exposes itself. There is no longer someone there to soften the avoidant's detachment or make excuses for their inconsistency. The empath's absence of effort reveals the avoidant's absence of investment. To the avoidant, this feels like the ground shifting beneath them. They were accustomed to the emotional safety net, always being caught, always being understood, always being given another chance to come closer at their own pace. But once the empath withdraws their effort, the avoidant is confronted with something deeply uncomfortable. The understanding that relationships are not maintained by distance, but by engagement. And without the empath's steady presence, their habitual avoidance stops feeling protective and starts feeling isolating. Meanwhile, the empath begins to see clearly what they had been blind to before. They realize how much invisible labor they were performing. They recognize how many emotional debts they were forgiving without ever receiving repayment. They see how often they carried the weight of two people while the avoidant invested the bare minimum. The moment they stop giving, they also begin to notice how little was actually coming back. And that realization is liberating, not painful. The avoidant, on the other hand, begins to understand the true value of what they had. Not the softness of the empath's heart, but the strength of their devotion. Not just the love, but the effort behind the love. Because affection is easy, consistency is not. Words are easy, emotional presence is not. The empath offered something rare, active love. Love that shows up, engages, and participates. So when that effort disappears, when the empath finally steps back, the avoidant is thrust into an emotional reality they are not equipped to navigate. They must now face their own patterns without someone else absorbing the consequences. And this, more than anything, is what makes a fed-up empath the avoidant's greatest threat. Not anger, not resentment, but the quiet, unwavering decision to stop carrying the entire relationship alone. What the avoidant loses is the one thing they never appreciated enough, the empath's willingness to try. In the end, the power of a fed-up empath isn't found in anger but in awakening, a quiet, steady realization that their love was never the problem, but their self-neglect was. When they choose themselves, the entire dynamic changes, and the avoidant is left to confront what they lost. Not just affection, but the effort that held everything together. So here's to the empaths who finally recognize their worth, reclaim their boundaries, and remember that real connection never requires self-abandonment. Thank you for listening, for reflecting, and for honoring the strength it takes to love deeply, and the even greater strength it takes to walk away when that love is no longer returned.